So I'm Dr Niall Munro. I'm here with my colleague Dr Tinashe Mushakavanhu to talk a bit about Marechera again, and this time how he ended up in Port Meadow, which is an area of Oxford, North Oxford. It's a very large area of open space. It's 136.9 hectares as a site of special scientific interest, scheduled ancient monument, and together with a couple of other places called Yarnton and Pixie Mead, it's a special area of conservation. And the place itself, we've just come up on perhaps ill-advisedly a very cold day. It's something like -1 degrees, and we're standing right next to an open area which is flooded from the river. The River Thames runs just near here, and that area of open space is flooded and is now frozen. So there are people out there cycling, skidding around, skating, running around, sliding. So it's a really interesting time to actually be coming here, but possibly not the time when Marechera had his tent here. The landscape itself tells a really interesting history of Oxford. There are burial mounds from the Bronze Age around here. We can actually just see them, sort of mounded areas of overgrown land, and there are settlements still. You can still see vestiges of those from the Iron Age. People have been farming here since the 9th century, apparently, although I think this is disputed, maybe a myth. Myths are always interesting to think about when you think about Marechera, so this seems appropriate. But apparently some area of this land was granted by King Alfred back in the 9th century as to local people to farm or graze cattle on, as thanks for defending the kingdom against the Danes. But there is mention of that right actually in the Domesday Book in 1086, which, if you don't know, is a famous survey and valuation of land holding and resources, gigantic survey ordered by William the Conqueror. There are also, we've just passed them, fortifications around the city from the siege of Oxford during the English Civil War in the 1640s. But really, obviously, we're here to talk about Marechera. Marechera came here around March 1976 after he had been expelled from Oxford University and spent some time camping by the River Thames, which, as I say, flows through this part of Oxford. Marechera actually, when he's talking about the river, refers to it as the Isis, which is the sort of local name people give for the stretch of the Thames that passes through Oxford around the city. But Isis, of course, is a term that's become less popular recently, and I was actually reading that a lot of places have renamed after being called Isis Hotel or something like that, have now renamed themselves after the prominence of the terrorist group in the Middle East. But let's think a bit about what Marechera was doing here. Tinashe, can you tell us a little bit about how Marechera ended up in Port Meadow?
I mean, so after the expulsion from New College, he sort of, stays with friends. But again, because he's a very disagreeable character, he is chucked out and eventually finds himself in Port Meadow, where he doesn't have to pay rent. And my suspicion is that he found a group of drifters and kind of joined them. These were people who were camping near the river, and I think it kind of suited his own idea of a writer. So the kind of romanticism of himself, begins in that moment where he finds this opportunity to live away from a conventional life. I think that is the beginnings of Marechera sort of testing out a way of living that becomes his way of living to the very end of his life. So yeah, he comes to Port Meadow, and he claims to have written his book, The House of Hunger. He writes that I managed to get myself a tent. I would camp by the river Isis. I wrote most of House of Hunger in that tent. I remember the first time I came there, the police came around. It was a very small tent. I had to crawl on all fours. I couldn't stand up. I either had to lie down on or sit cramped with a typewriter just typing. Suddenly there was this policeman saying, "Hello, hello, what's going on?" I said, "I'm writing a book." They asked if I was a student. I said yes. I still had my university card. They left me alone after that. So this has become legendary. This is how everybody, all of us think and talk about Marechera from this point onwards. This is the beginnings or the birth of Marechera the writer.
And how much of this do you think is true? I mean, was he really in a tent? First of all, was he really writing House of Hunger, this extraordinary book, which eventually becomes this award-winning novel and short stories?
I mean, it is possible. It is possible that he could have been in a tent. To what extent, for how long, nobody really knows, because there's been no witness testimony to that part of his life. But he did become a drifter, and sort of camped and slept on doorways and all kinds of things. So there is a truth to this existence of Marechera. Yeah.
And to an extent, we're kind of relying, I guess, on the source book, right? The Dambudzo Marechera source book, which has been compiled by Flora Wild, which came out in 2004, which has a lot of interviews, doesn't it, with kind of his contemporaries and friends, and they say quite a bit about having to look after him, I suppose, when he was here, after he was sort of thrown out of the university, and what his motivations were. And his motivations seemed to be he was in quite a depressed state, I think, at this point, wasn't he? He needed something to kind of find some way of kind of recapturing a sense of himself, I suppose, and his purpose in life.
Yeah, I mean, he had also fallen out, I think when I interviewed Stanley Nyamfukudza, another Zimbabwean writer who was in Oxford at the same time as Marechera.
He had a flat here, didn't he?
He had a flat, yeah, he was married and had a small family, and so in the initial days after expulsion, Marechera pretty much stayed with them. But I remember when I interviewed him, almost a decade ago, he said to me, there was this sizable Zimbabwean group of students, and Marechera was one of us. But because of his unpredictable behavior, he had pretty much fallen out with most of those people. So when he eventually drifts, it's partly because the community that he belongs to doesn't want to be associated with him anymore. And I think everybody was very much preoccupied with trying to get the Oxford degree that Marechera in that moment had spanned.
Just looking around this landscape, I mean, it's not a great time to look around. It's early evening, so there's not a huge amount you can see, but there's actually a fairly remarkable sunset, kind of orange. You can see the sort of trees in the distance being sort of illuminated by the orange light, and these various different sort of extraordinary shades of dark blue and almost indigo. Do you think you would have been attracted to this kind of landscape? It's very bare, it's very sparse, kind of elemental.
I mean, I think for anyone with an imagination, I think it's a romantic place. You can build any castles here. You can build any worlds here. And I think for a person like Marechera, this was a beautiful canvas to build, a story about himself. And in that moment, he kind of pretty much retreated into his childhood, and this was a perfect place to retreat back to Rhodesia of the 50s and 60s. And what we ended up having is a remarkable book in the form of the House of Hunger, which, I mean, was originally called at the head of the stream. So there could be a way in which there was a direct reference, to the proximity to the river. And I think, it's something that has not necessarily been explored or critically analyzed or scrutinized, but there's a feeling that he's also giving us bearings of where he is imagining from.
I mean, it's funny actually, because I was thinking about him the other day and thinking about he wrote that essay, well, it was still at Oxford, about Wuthering Heights, because he felt some attraction to that character Heathcliff, right? He's very much an outsider who has these sort of slightly mysterious origins. People don't really know where he's come from, and I think Marechera was quite disappointed. Nobody could tell him where he'd actually had come from, and nobody identified himself to an extent with Heathcliff. So maybe he looked around here and he saw the Yorkshire moors. I don't know. Kind of, particularly on a day like this, you could imagine it being sort of bleak and sort of forbidding and full of kind of ghosts and haunted memories.
Yeah, I mean, it allows him to, in a sense, it also allows him to write himself into kind of these literary genealogies, because I think that is one aspect of Marechera's life as a writer that is fascinating. His ability to connect himself to, global literary figures or global literary moments, and he does that beautifully.
So he comes here, and he may or may not have been writing House of Hunger, or may or may not have kind of finished it, or he may have written some of it at friends' houses around Oxford, and maybe part of it in London once he goes there in 1977. But he does produce it. So should we look at the opening paragraph of it, which, again, we're not entirely sure, but it seems to speak really interestingly to just this space, actually, this place, and maybe his relationship with the city, and as you say, the fact that he retreats, or goes back into his childhood imagination.
I got my things and left. The sun was coming up. I couldn't think where to go. I wandered towards the beer hall, but stopped at the bottle store where I bought a beer. There were people scattered along the store's wide veranda drinking. I sat beneath the tall musasa tree whose branches scraped the corrugated iron roofs. I was trying not to think about where I was going. I didn't feel bitter. I was glad things had happened the way they had. I couldn't have stayed on in that house of hunger, where every morsel of sanity was snatched from you the way some kinds of birds snatch food from the very mouths of babes. And the eyes of that house of hunger lingered upon you as though some indefinable beast was about to pounce upon you. Of course, there was the matter of the girl, but what else could I have done when Peter flogged her, like that day and night? Besides, my intervention had not been as disinterested as I would have liked. Yes, the sun came up so fast it hit you between the eyes. Before you knew it, it had risen above the mountains.
So that's very evidently not Oxford or here. Where is it? And can you see connections maybe between how he is feeling, having left the university, where he is now, and then why he decides to write what he does?
I mean, there's connections, there's connections about, deserting, about living, about, wandering. So there is a connection to what happens with his relationship with Oxford. I think when Marechera's father died when he was young, and they were evicted from the house that they lived in, and they ended up living in a shack with his mother and 8 other siblings. So that there's that sense of abandonment, sense of desertion, sense of escape. And I think, what is particularly fascinating is that this is what this landscape of Port Meadow does. It takes him back to that moment of desertion, and he internalizes it, and it sort of opens up as a journey. And I feel like he doesn't even know where that journey is going to take him, and for whatever reason it takes him back to his childhood.
And I guess we may have talked before about the way in which he is constantly on the move. He often talks about not having a sense of home, kind of being placeless, of rootlessness, I think he says at one point. So there's a real sense in which, I guess, if you're in a tent, that's a temporary stay. There's no way in which you're going to live there forever.
Yeah, the idea of impermanence with Marechera, is, becomes a thing after staying in Port Meadow. I think after that he just refuses to have a home, refuses to, to have a conventional life, So there's an active attempt, or an active refusal to conform, and that kind of takes root from sort of camping at Port Meadow, and that is what it takes, So he moves around with a rucksack, he calls his backpack a rucksack that only has his books and writings and a typewriter, and that becomes his home. So if there's any constant thing, even here at Port Meadow, when he talks about writing his book, the one constant thing that he has is his typewriter. So the typewriter, for the rest of Marechera's life, wherever you find him, that is the only constant that stays with him.
And you get a real sense of that, I suppose, in the opening line. I got my things and left, the kind of sense of constantly being on the move, but also those things aren't very specific.
Yeah.
It's just, it doesn't really matter actually what they are, as long as he has the essentials. Everything else is kind of just what he picks up along the way.
Yeah. And I think those things are also the stories. The stories he's carrying, the stories he's writing, the stories he is sharing. I think those are his bare essential, tools that he needs for survival.
And I guess we also get the sense of maybe isolation from that as well. He gets his things and leaves, and then he describes that kind of space, which is drawing on his own personal kind of growing up in Wasape, right? So that kind of sense in which there's the village and there's the kind of beer hall and those kind of familiar landscapes. So he is feeling kind of, I guess, what simultaneously connected to that space again, space of childhood, but also kind of detached from it because he is in a completely different place.
Yeah, so, isolation is a theme in Marechera's life. I think he becomes alienated from his own family from that moment when his father dies, and I think there is never a connection, and I think slowly the distance between himself and the family grows bigger and bigger to a point where there's total blackout. There's no more communication. He loses contact with his mother, with his brothers and sisters, and just like pretty much lives in his own head.
And so he writes this book over a period of something like 11 months. Is that about right?
Well, I mean, so House of Hunger, the actual House of Hunger, is a pretty much an extended short story. So it's a novella. So that was like that was all he did. That was all he wrote, and submitted to Heinemann. But for Heinemann, that was not enough. So he had to present extra material. So he eventually sent short stories, some of which were about his experiences in Oxford, and so the book became a combination of genres. The first time that Heinemann was also doing that. So before Marechera's book was published by Heinemann in 1978, they never introduced a new writer with a short story collection or with any kind of medley, composition of writings. They almost always wanted you to start with a novel. And with Marechera, it was like the first time that they had to break their own rules. And so House of Hunger was number 207 in the Heinemann series. And in that moment...
Like an African writer series.
In the African writer series. So in that moment, the House of Hunger pretty much breaks the rules. So they in a sense, I think the African writer series was also at a desperate point where they needed to reinvent themselves because it had become very much formulaic. And the House of Hunger just allowed them to reimagine what African writing could look like.
That's very fascinating. And you get a sense, we'll talk about this another time, but the readers' reports that come back, almost all of them say he's got a novel in him. He's going to write a great novel. So, it's all very well having these short stories, but actually what we really want is kind of a great African novel. But as we'll see, he doesn't eventually produce what they are looking for. Partly because of, as you say, he's much more interested in, I guess, in breaking the rules, in not actually following the kind of institutional way of thinking, which we know very well because he ends up in Port Meadow having left one gigantic institution to be maybe sort of free from its rules.
Yeah, but I mean, it's also a writing that mirrors the way he's living, because it's a nomadic existence. It's not a rooted existence. It's not comfortable. So the writing pretty much mirrors the way that Marechera is living. So it's kind of written in parts, and then almost all his publications are a combination of these different parts that are composed in all these like different spaces that he finds himself.